Michael. Hey, Stacey.
Hey,
Hello.
Diane.
Well, we are doing something for the first time here on Class Disrupted. We are recording a two-part podcast. And so here we are in part two. We've got the amazing Stacey Childress with us for this experiment, and she's hanging in there. She came back for number two. So as a reminder, here is what we're up to. The three of us all listened to a very lengthy multi-part podcast by Marc Andreseen and Ben Horowitz, very successful and respected VCs and entrepreneurs. And their podcast broke down the problems with higher education and the solutions as they sort of saw them and proposed them. And then also had a third session on questions from X, Twitter, whatever you want to call that thing. So lots of people told us we had to listen to what they were saying, and we did. And then quite frankly, we really felt compelled to join in this really important discussion. We were super grateful they were having it. We felt like we could add some things. And so in our last episode, we tackled the problem that they had laid out in their first episode. So we did that in our first, and really broke down what they got right, what they missed, what some things we had some quibbles with. And today we want to flip to their solutions. So kind of mirroring their approach.
Yeah. And I suffice to say, I think we had a lot we liked in the problems that they identified. Some nuance that we tried to add to their conversation to set us up, I think, for a more productive set of solutions. And again, the disclosure that we're all on the board of Minerva University, and we kind of think that we might be an interesting solution to some of the problems that they posed. But with that as sort of prelude, I think let's just jump right in. They offered a bunch of solutions as they went down the bundle of their 12. They talked a lot about how you could unbundle and rebundle a lot. I thought that was an insightful framing as you think about solutions to these operations and you know these real valuable functions that places play. So Diane, where would you like to dive in?
Well, for me, Michael, the solution episode is where things really got spicy, and so and that really isn't a surprise. I often find that people are really good at breaking down and dissecting problems, but they often don't offer very satisfying or promising solutions, especially when you're talking about like big complex systems problems. And so I'm not surprised that I wasn't feeling satisfied in that episode. And in fact, I feel like I've made this complaint about a lot of the books that I've recommended on this podcast. So it's not that there's not value in there, but I definitely have some disappointment with the solutions that Marc and Ben proposed, and that lots of other people propose, especially when you get into education. And so I guess where I want to start is let's just go through some of them. And I pulled a bunch of them out. I'm curious what you all think about them. And so let me just start on the positive, what I agreed with. And we talked a lot about this in the first episode, so don't have to spend a lot of time here. But I actually agreed with their solution that one of the things that colleges and universities need to do is focus on educating students and, refocus, reignite their purpose around that. And in doing so, they should be able to reduce administrative overhead. And so, they talked a lot about how there in a number of universities, there are reports now that there are literally more administrative people than there are students, which kind of to any person sounds insane. And I think we know that to actually be true. They have a perception of cost ballooning. Michael, you gave us some real nuance around that in the last episode, so we can take that or leave that. But this ballooning, this lack of focus contributes to a lack of direct service to students. And we should just literally dramatically reduce admin, and in doing so, reduce cost. And so I'm curious what you guys think. The last thing I will just say quickly before I turn it to you is I do believe this is something we've done at Minerva. Minerva has prioritized student learning, the student experience. The three of us as trustees know for a fact that the admin is quite lean. And that cost structure is significantly leaner as well. So I do think we have at least one proof point that it can be done.
Yeah, Stacey, why don't you jump in first? And this is the format we'll follow for people listening. Diane's going to go through her list. Stacey and I'll react bullet by bullet, so to speak. So go ahead,
Yeah.
Stacey, first.
Yeah, like, on this one about refocusing on students, or on this, I would say refocusing on the purpose of the time, in the program, whether that's 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, because I think you could play with timing, as an innovation potentially. But while we're here together learning, much more focus on purpose and gener helping young people expand their opportunity set. Like that, like, to me, it can be an early function of 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 a higher ed experience in your first year or two, where you're able to get better, clearer insight into a path or multiple paths that you may or may not have come in thinking that's the path you're on.
Mm,
Now, for lots of kids, they just come right in and go, and that's fine. But lots of them don't. And so just like thinking about like what's really the purpose of the first year? What's really the
mm,
purpose of that bridge from first to second year? Like what are we trying to help make sure students get to the middle of their second year, at the end of their third semester, kind of knowing about themselves, knowing about what comes next and what needs to happen. Like just really kind of think of that backwards mapping. If we're headed here, how would we think about what needs to happen from the beginning to get there? And I just don't think that's happening anymore. So I liked the idea that it might be possible for institutions that want to really focus themselves on student development and acceleration to rethink the way the experience works without having to add a ton of cost, and in fact, probably be able to reduce costs if they really streamlined around that purpose, therefore that value prop, therefore that experience that needs to be created and managed over time. So they didn't exactly suggest that, but I do think from a solution standpoint, I think there's real power there. And we said that with Minerva, we've got more of that mindset, but we were able to design it from the beginning that way, or we weren't. I wasn't there at the very beginning, but not too long after. But that's the purpose at Minerva, and we're organized around it and can constantly get better at it for sure, but we're organized around it. And I think it's a thing that existing institutions could move to. It doesn't seem impossible. It seems really hard, and it would take some time. But I think we have some examples of the improvement of some credentialing.
mhm.
I'm most familiar with it around master's programs, but I think that's actually gives me a little bit of hope that you could think differently about the experience in ways that doesn't require you to blow up everything,
Yeah.
but does create opportunities to redesign at the kind of major slash, degree type of degree level. I don't
Hmm.
know. I think it's possible and and
That's
and
sure.
desirable. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting. I like also how you said it, Stacey, which is regardless of what the universities do, they need to focus around a purpose. And so for some institutions, I will be delighted if they say it's research because I
Yeah.
think that's a very important societal function that's different from the one we've chosen at Minerva, which is fundamentally students. I think doing so on either end, I think will reduce administrative overhead and cost bloat. I think you need that clarity. I will say the second add to you all that I think maybe I don't know that it's a disagreement, but it follows from where you were going, Stacey, which is like I don't think it's quite student centered. I think it's student purpose. And so meaning like if we're backward mapping from we want these individuals to go out into the employment world and society and be able to contribute, what does it mean? And in I think it's a slight addendum to the student centered language, only in the sense that you could argue that the opulent dining halls and residential palaces and so forth of colleges are very student centered in a weird kind of way. But I think it's because they've treated students as customers as opposed to clients. And my distinction there is simply like the customer's always right. With the client, you kind of got to nudge them and
Yeah.
help lead them because you're helping develop them, right? And so that's
Yeah.
my one sort of maybe controversial nuance. But I think we should have teaching institutions. They shouldn't try to do research. and we should have far fewer research institutions, but I still want some of them.
Yeah, I love that distinction,
Mm.
Michael, and it's so interesting how I think about this kind of as a like an insider and then a parent perspective in that I actually, as a parent, see those sort of, let's call them resort style or luxury resort universities as detrimental to the development of people in the 18 to
Sure.
25 range. And so I don't ever see that as a positive. And like, but you're right, that's what some, especially like elite families want, and that's like driving things. So super interesting. I will just say that Minerva is the opposite of that, as we both know. It really is designed to help develop young emerging adults and their skills, and it's really impressive on this front.
And they've done that backward mapping that
Totally.
Stacey just described in excruciating, incredible, awesome detail.
Yeah, yeah,
Absolutely. Brilliant.
yeah. Yep. Okay, so the second solution that I agree with, and here's where I'm really going to practice some grace because I don't really think they said it the way that I would. That, but anyway, they seem to believe that it would be really healthy to have different universities and different departments within universities offering really different opportunities and appealing to different people and interests and passions and skills. I think they say that repeatedly, and I believe that that's really something they care about. And I 100% sign on to and agree with that. Like, I'm super excited about that. Right now, we have like one flavor and they're all vanilla. And how could we have some really, different types of offerings? However, they in that conversation, they got all caught up in DEI and politically hot topics, and so their discussion of it was kind of bumbly, and in some cases came across as sort of biased and stereotypical. We unpacked that a lot on the last episode, so I'm not going to go back there. So instead, what I'm going to try to do is like say what I think they would sign on to, given what I tried to hear through what they were talking about, which is what I would call the Todd Rose approach. And, Michael and I have talked to Todd a couple times on the podcast, but basically he really advocates for the end of average, which in his, research and work suggests that what we're promoting in university admissions right now is everyone driving towards being on a very small number of measures, as the same as everyone, only better. So it's like we're all going to be good at these three things, and now I'm just going to try to get better than you, versus recognizing that the world needs whatever, hundreds, thousands of different things, and that different people bring those different, and we would be so much better served if we were cultivating all that diversity of talent and expertise and interest. And if we had a collective university system that was really enabling and doing that. And so, I think they were trying to zoom out to that systems level, and say like, wouldn't that would be ideal. And I want to throw it to you all, because I do think this concept of like, imagine if students were applying to colleges not because of their ranking in US News World Reports or wherever we're getting it these days, but because it was really a good fit for
Good
them
fit.
personally. I mean, that's the ideal that I think Ben and Marc would sign on to. I think society would benefit from, and I think it would, gosh, just be so much healthier for our young people and our country.
I love where you just landed, Diane, because to me, it took them a while to get there, which I think is what you're saying. But I think that was the underlying essence, which is that they were saying it's not just math and English language arts that matter. If you're an awesome musician, there should be a way to show that. Right. And then I think it would make it easier, frankly, for colleges to differentiate, which is the art of strategy. Colleges don't like differentiating right now, to your point, the opposite of strategy. That's part of the problem. But I think, they had this, I think, somewhat bizarrely said SAT should be infinitely scored. I, I, I kind of agree with it. Like, if you're really good at math, I'd love to see how high you can get. And I want lots of other performance measures that you could showcase your talents on to show who you are. And you're going to have this jagged profile at the end of the day. And I think that's, again, I'm not sure that they said it that way, but I think that's what they fundamentally were driving at. And I'd love to see it. If you get out of the SAT as IQ test, I think you can make that leap a lot easier. And then it gets exciting. And I think, Stacey, and I'll throw it to you here, I think it also gets around in the longer run, this point you were raising in the last episode, that like we're actually not ready to leave the SAT, because if when we do, it actually becomes worse and more biased toward people who have
Right.
lots of wealth to develop essays and projects and like go on saving the whales and, blah, blah, blah. Right. Like things that we're not sure we're sorry about we're trying to optimize for. So
As I used to say, not really my issue. Like I'm glad somebody cares about that. It's just I do like the whales. It's not really my issue. Yeah, like listen, I am all in on, as you know, on jagged profiles. Both as a just a was a concept and as a common sense approach to how the world actually works. And again, I think that's a lot of what they got right, both in diagnosis and problem and solutioning, or at least feeding into potential solutions. Is we just don't. There aren't enough choices. Like there are 4,000 institutions, but Diane, to your point, there are a handful, or maybe 4 or 5 handfuls, that are really kind of driving what good is supposed to look like, whether that's right or wrong, and then all the other ones trying to kind of look the best they can against that standard. And I think I actually would be cautious about any one institution, no matter how large or small, how financially healthy or not. I'd be cautious about saying do more programs, like proliferate programs. Like, Michael, like you have spent some time both advising and teaching at the Harvard Graduate School of Education in the last few years. And I think one really smart thing they've done is fewer programs.
yeah, narrow. Yeah.
Let's have fewer of these. And so you can make more sense out of what a degree from Harvard Graduate School of Education means at the end of it, because you didn't have, there were literally like 42 paths or something, and it's, down in the teens now. It's like a big step forward. And so I wouldn't suggest more. I would suggest more in aggregate, right? And so to your point, Diane, like what opportunity does it create for institutions to find their place in the ecosystem on the few things they can just be world class in, even if they're a smaller institution, kind of, in the middle of the country someplace, in a charming town, but not a destination spot, but they get really good at a few paths. And us developing ways at the system level to let kids know about those, or young people know about those options, these different places that you might go. And then the jagged profile, like if you can have some services emerge for matching jagged profiles to institutions, where you don't have to be one particular profile to do well there, but if you kind of fall in these ways, this is a way to continue to develop on these criteria you want to work on. Or if you want to look, the guys on the podcast saw college as a way out of being a busboy and doing dishes when they were 17 or 18, right? And so I don't want my jagged profile to be steady state,
right?
Mostly filled in with things I'm interested in as a teenager,
right.
and busboy, but I do want some sense of where I am at that age and where I might want to push in if I'm interested in some other things and being able to explore. So how does the ecosystem develop in ways that allows for, I'll just call it the supply of opportunities to be there in a very vibrant and differentiated set of options, and some way of finding those options with a little bit of intelligence as a student and as a family about my student's jagged profile, right? I don't want my jagged profile to be driven by some of my immutable characteristics like race and gender and presumptions about what I might like or not like based on that. But yeah, I'm different from you, Diane, and from you, Michael. We've had a lot of things in common and a lot of things that are different from one another. And we always have. Everyone does.
Diane, can I just one quick build off of that, because it reminded me of two things. One, I loved it how like the implication of what Stacey just said would solve the administrative overhead problem that you started with, Diane.
Mhm.
I think that is I disagreed with their solution of just slash half the administration. You can't, as long as the bundle is what it is. And it's
Mhm.
not a go back to
Exactly.
operating like how you were in year 2000, because that the world has changed. It's incredibly naive. And so that part of it, I think where you just went with that, Stacey, is right. The other piece of this that just occurred to me is if you truly get good at the jagged profile piece, then a part I was in total agreement with Ben on was one of the biggest solutions, I think, was starting the credentialing thing, if you will, that was actually certifying competence. And I think my conclusion, I've written about the whole, I've written a whole paper about this, about how we're never going to get to competency based education unless there are these independent entities
Yeah.
that are there to verify competency and mastery. And it's in practice, it's really, really, really hard to do. Like, we have all these one-offs, right? Google, Microsoft, they don't stand in for the bundle. Once you get into the less rules-based stuff, are like, we get worse and worse at it. And so I guess I would just say, if we solved it on the front end, Diane, I'm curious what you think, but like, we actually might build into something that could solve it on the back end. And that would actually lower the price, I think, of higher ed.
Yeah, like I'm bursting with things right now, so I'm gonna do 3 things all here at once. One,
Good.
I wanna just add on to this, I think this really important conversation. So here's what I would offer as like a counterintuitive solution to what we've just been talking about that I know is true in the K-12 sector. So people think that in order to offer more choice and more personalization, that you have to do it in big structural ways. You have to add like a new major, you have to add a new school of something, you have to add. It's not true. The way you actually do it and reduce at the same time is in how you're designing those programs to be significantly more personalized, significantly more differentiated. So you're actually solving the problem of the horrible pedagogy,
Right.
and you're not expanding the structure of the university. Now, this is so
Interesting.
nerdy. Like, if you don't design the education and whatnot, you would never know that this is how you do this. But like, Minerva is a perfect example. They literally have 5 degrees. That's it. Name me another university that only has 5 degrees. They've just exploded. But within those degrees, the experience is so hands-on, so project-based, so differentiated.
That you can
That's where
personalize.
people are really matching up. And so
Yeah.
I think that's actually the path forward on that.
It's super
That's very cool.
fascinating, right? And it is counterintuitive because you're
Yep,
solving the scale system problem at the unit level, right? At
totally.
the unit of the learner and the learner experience, and it actually doesn't add overhead. It helps you
Totally.
trim. It's fascinating. Yeah,
It's
I
my favorite kind of
really
solution, which,
like
as
it.
you all
Yeah.
know, I call the kitchen tool solution. I have a small kitchen. I'm a big cook. I can't have that many tools. They have to do multiple jobs. So I love it as a kitchen tool solution. Michael, you also took us. So there's some other things we agree with, which we might get back to, but I'm going to take us into the disagree because you sort of led us there to this like fixing the outgoing credential problem, which look, I think we all agree, like there's a lot of disruption happening in society right now about these credentials, right? And it's really unclear where they are but last time I checked, all the elite employers are still hiring people from Stanford and Harvard. So that's super real. But you led us into their solution, and this might have been one of the most mind-boggling proposals. And it falls into a category that's very natural for people, is when they don't know what to do, they think you need to do something different, they go back to something versus forward. And what Ben and Marc did was go back to the concept that in order to fix the credentialing problem and the lack of, we should start grading on a curve again. And I almost lost it, you guys, because I had to take a break at that moment, because that is the dumbest idea I've heard in a really long time.
Dumbest?
It's a horrible idea. And
Okay.
it,
Stacey's going to bring the nuance, Diane.
quite frankly, they like they broke it down why it was a horrible idea. So I'll leave that to them. What is a good idea, and it's what we all talk about and what the three of us are driving for, is competency mastery based assessment and learning. And it's what you're pointing to, Michael. And yes, we do. And so first of all, I just want people to understand this is a real thing. It's true. It's possible. There are competency based assessments that are valid and are reliable, more and more coming available every day. And in fact, one of the big problems is a lot of institutions don't use them. So
Yeah.
we would have way more of these in the market if people were actually using them. And I say this because I built a whole system that does competency-based learning and assessments. And now we had Tim Knowles on the podcast earlier this year. Like, this is Carnegie, the Foundation for Advancement of Teaching and Learning, and our partnership with ETS is all about this. So let us not believe that these things aren't possible and don't exist. They are, and they do. And we as consumers have to start demanding them, buying them, using them, making them better.
Yeah. I mean, here was the big irony, right? Which was, I totally agree with everything you just said, Diane. And I agree with them that the incentives currently suck, right? In terms of why there's great inflation. And their credentialing idea, that's where you can go, right? Like, we're going to have a way to prove mastery, and we're going to say, yep, you got it. No, you got to keep working. Or you as an individual could say, maybe this isn't my bag. Right. And that's okay at this level, I think, to learn what you really want. And you're not going to
Yeah.
make claims of, I got a C on this because I showed up and I turned it in, and what 30% didn't, like all those, right? Like, and so I'm totally 1000%. I thought the irony was that the credentialing idea that Ben wants to invest in, I think, is an answer to this. I will add, I do not think that existing institutions, I know that many hundreds of them are saying that they are launching competency-based programs. I do not believe that most of them are going to be competency-based. I do not believe that they are able to untether from the credit hour, move fundamentally to learning for the reason you just said, Diane. They're not using these assessments. They're not fundamentally able to move to a world in which learning is the currency rather than time. And I think this is where you have to have a third-party credentialer and a new ecosystem of the Western Governors Universities, the Southern New Hampshire Universities, et cetera, build around them. Stacey.
Yeah. Yes. I'm not going to yet take the bait on the discrete grading curve thing. I'll come back to that. I'm going to stay right here, which
you
is
were at the Harvard Business School where
I'm coming back to it. I'm coming back
had
to
to
it.
grade on a curve.
I'm going to come back to it. I so because I love this conversation or this thread. What it supply can't continue to develop, proliferate, deepen, innovate without sufficient demand for the type of thing, right? Is what you're saying, Diane. And so this assessment problem, it's more than an assessment problem, but it's an assessment infrastructure that supports a new learning model, right? That gets us to mastery-based, competency-based, enables us to do personalization more meaningfully. And this is where I think there was a miss on the solutions part, not about a specific solution, because I love the credentialing idea. We need a few of those, right? And
Yes, several.
I think the pushing the onus, Ben and Marc pushing the onus of, or not the onus, but the point of leverage over to others to drive these reforms, I think is short-sighted, because they have more power than maybe they acknowledged, and certainly as part of a business ecosystem in the country, have an enormous amount of power as employers to require something different of existing institutions, and therefore open up opportunities for new institutions to emerge, right? New models
Great
to
point.
emerge. And they can do that by the way they will and won't hire, right? And And I know that's challenging because they need this influx of new talent every year, and they plan for it to be able to operate their models. But unless employers, it's a hypothesis, but I think unless employers really pressure the institutions that are currently credentialing students to do something different, it's not going to happen. Like, even the third party credentialer has a hard time taking off if the
Yep.
educational models actually don't prepare students well to demonstrate competency in the third party credentialing protocols, right? So I think I think because it's a market challenge, even though we're
Yep.
talking about higher ed and a big chunk of it's nonprofit, it's still a market.
Yep.
And the output of the system is talent. There's a market for talent. Who's driving that market for talent on the consumer, the buyer side is companies, and they're going to have to way more organized pressure than they do now. And I think it's doable. I think it's absolutely
Yeah.
doable. And look, there's a lot of one thing I appreciate about just the podcast in general was they didn't really take the bait on super woke versus non woke. Like, there were some allusions to it and stuff like that, which were fine. But like, there are employers making noises right now about who they will and won't hire
Yep.
based on current attitudes, behaviors, speech. And like, I don't love that, but I don't hate it. Like, okay, like, employers can do that. Well, if they can do that, they can do this. They can do what we're talking about, which is a much longer term, more systemic way to really increase quality overall, quality of learning, quality of the signaling, quality of
Yeah.
the incoming talent pool. And
Yep.
so, like, yeah, businesses, let's get organized around
Yep.
hiring and not hiring based on some things that actually really matter
Yep.
fundamentally for the health of the economy, for human flourishing, et cetera, et cetera. So,
Yeah, this point about the power of the employers is in the section in my mind of what they sort of overlooked or their blind
yeah,
spot. And I think it comes to like people we often like forget the power that we have. And so
do.
I'd love to come back to that a little bit on another example, but I want to stick here because one of their other solutions was to fix grade inflation. And this was like a solution that was so that they could make the credential more valuable and the value proposition. So it was sort of this adjacent solution to what we've been talking
Mm,
about. I will say they got into this whole conversation about adjunct professors versus tenure professors and like all of this stuff about like whatever. It was a little bit confusing. Here's what I would say about I feel like fixing grade inflation like kind of misses the point here. I think the actual solution that they would be looking for and want is unbundle the role of the professor in higher ed because that's actually the problem. That's at the root of the issue. We see this in K-12. Teachers have too many hats they have to wear. They're supposed to teach the kids, they're supposed to coach them, they're supposed to mentor them, they're supposed to counsel them, and they have to evaluate their work performance and they have to recommend them. Those, Michael and I have talked about this for years. Those roles are in conflict. There's an inherent conflict in there. And we're asking these people to play these two roles and then getting mad at them when they are trying to promote kids that they are deeply invested in and care about. And so I would say for that and many
mm,
reasons, they love unbundling. I think they should drop down a level and say, like, how do we unbundle the role of the professor in higher ed? We've sort of failed miserably so far at doing this in K-12, but maybe it's more possible at higher ed. And I think this speaks to your idea of, Michael, like disaggregating the research piece. I just think there's
Yeah.
so much opportunity on unbundling the role of the professors.
Well, and I
So,
won't ding them for not knowing this, but this is exactly what Western Governors University has done. They have unbundled the role of the faculty member. They have 5 different
mm,
roles for faculty members: life
mm,
coach, course coach, instructional designer, I'm missing one, and assessment.
mm,
And they're all separate. And it's one of the reasons I wonder Western Governors University has set up WGU Labs. Might all of the expertise that they have developed in assessing
mm.
competency, because they are a competency based institution, be something that they can spin out so other people can start building toward it, and start to do this even more. Diane, I think
Yeah,
it's a great. I'm totally with you.
totally.
Let me grab another one that I disagreed with, because once I get this one off my chest, then I think I'll feel okay, and we can. Which is they that one of their solutions was, and they sort of said it a little bit like off the cuff, tongue in cheek, a little, but we're pretty serious about it. Was like, look, if universities are charging $70,000 a year in tuition, if that's the price tag of a university, you could literally hire a full-time tutor that would tutor your young person like, Socrates and Aristotle, and sort of in that old one-to-one tutoring model. And they spent a lot of time talking about a study that we all know very, very well, a study done by Ben Bloom that showed the power of one-to-one tutoring. It's true. It's a real study. We all care about it, and I think they really lost a lot of nuance around that study, and what it actually showed. And for me, a couple of things that were problematic on just the very technical side. You can't hire a tutor for $70,000 a year that is going to be Aristotle-like. That is insane. And as business people, that's crazy. Like, please. So that business model doesn't work. And the second thing that really baffled me in this solution was their complete failure to think about scale here. We can't even find enough teachers in America. How in the world do we think we're going to scale one-to-one tutoring, even if we had the resources to do that? It makes no sense. Now, they were talking about like combos of AI, etc. Fine. I would say tutoring is not a solution to the problem of higher ed. It's certainly something we should be thinking about working on using as a tool in our tool belt, but it's not a solution.
I'll just say
Well,
+1. Go ahead, Stacey.
listen, I literally thought I'd gotten in a time machine and gone back to 2010 when we all started kind of professionally really moving in the same direction. When Bloom's study was the hot topic and kind of the talisman, this is how we're going to get to, this is the model for personalized learning, and how can, the two sigma problem is Bloom showed it's possible with mastery based
Yeah.
one-to-one tutoring, which is a thing, mastery-based tutoring. Like, it's a very specific model of pedagogy, which is a thing they missed, I think missed.
Yeah.
Yes.
And yeah, the scale up was like, so the two sigma problem is, how do we do this at scale? And they made a very good point. We all know what it's like. All know the impact that one great teacher can have.
Yeah.
And it's just, a devilish problem to try to make a million great teachers, right? Like that's the challenge on the human front. And Michael, I know you and I share a perspective on this. Like, Bloom's methodology like overstates effect size by, it took me a while to get there on my path over the last 14 or 15 years, but like effect size is overstated. Algorithmic approaches to trying to get the technology to mimic that type of tutoring just really hasn't panned out. Lots have tried, again, hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars of philanthropy and venture capital into that problem or goal. AI might put us on different footing there. You could really imagine something more akin in some domains to a mastery-based model of individual support for
Yep.
young people that could, approximate maybe some of the results. I don't know about you, Michael, but like I'm skeptical of the 2 sigma, the 98th percentile result, moving kids at the 50th
Yeah.
percentile reliably to the 98th percentile at scale. I think I'd take half that. Like if I could get 50% to 75% percentile, in a reliable and affordable way, I think I'd be all in on that. What I don't think is that it is a single solution. It's always been my problem with this conversation about tutoring, which is it a thing that we're going to do on the side because other things aren't working. And so therefore, let's do one-on-one tutoring, and that works for some kids and not others. And yeah, now we need 15 million great mastery-based tutors who can each support 3 kids instead of just 3 million teachers that we already don't know how to do. So like it starts to get at that challenge. But what I will say is what always continues to motivate me about the Bloom insight, whatever the effect size is, whatever the model is, whatever the scalability challenges are, it's twofold. One is, isn't that really what we want education to be, regardless of how we actually operationalize it? Whether it's Aristotle and Socrates today, but really some version of ChatGPT, probably not going to happen. Maybe not even all that desirable. Or through some other, I'll just use the word bundle, even though I don't mean it in the way they were talking about, some other basket of experiences that allow for the personalization you were talking about earlier, Diane, which technology can help and support, but isn't a point solution for it. I guess that's the thing to break out of. Like, when you see, well, one-to-one tutoring, and no matter what, it reliably shows this, and if we could just do that. I did think listen, it was a cheeky aside that they made, kind of as a joke, and it did make me laugh. But I do think this is a good push. When we do get to the moment that there are as many administrators and faculty as there are students, and this is true in some institutions that the three of us know, love, and give a lot of credit for helping us accelerate toward the wonderful lives we're leading now, you start to say, can we really not afford it?
Yeah.
Because
No,
maybe we can't afford it. We're
it's
just not
true.
spending on it. And
Yeah.
maybe the
We're not
model isn't
making the
really
choices.
one-to-one, but maybe it is one-to-one in terms of
Yeah.
headcount. And then you've got this unbundling idea, Diane, that you were proposing, and that I know Michael has talked a lot about, unbundling the role of the instructor, the professor. So then you still have the same number of people, and maybe the cost model stays similar, but it's worth it. It's way more effective, it's way more productive, because for the same amount of money, you're getting a 75th percentile result instead of a 50th percentile result.
Yeah.
Like, if we could just like use the inspiration of the
Yeah.
Bloom model, not say let's try to replicate it exactly, but
Yeah.
what might it push us to re-examine about the current
Yeah.
structure, and what might be possible if we weren't so wedded to the operational model that we have.
Yeah.
So anyway,
We could go
but
on this one
I did feel like
forever.
it was a time
I'm
machine.
just not. I'm just nodding. I think this is a good point. I will say the irony I thought was they said nothing in education scales except for the Benjamin Bloom thing.
I
I was like,
know.
what? Anyway,
Yeah.
It's the whole point
I've gone
of
through
the
my list
paper. The
though.
problem of
Yeah.
the Two Sigma problem is that it doesn't scale.
Let me just say quickly, because I think we're going to all be in agreement on this. They as VCs, it was interesting that they were surprisingly skeptical of startup competitors. So competitors in the space that could be universities, if you will, new startup competitors. And they cited their major skepticism around what they call the accreditation cartel, which is been not surprising because VCs kind of don't like regulated industries. They're, for good reason, I think. I just would say quickly, I think they missed Minerva here. Minerva is literally a startup against the, two in the space that they're talking about. So we should just say that out loud. I would also say that
They did mention it. They did mention it,
they
Diane.
did mention it. They did
They
mention it.
didn't. Yeah, they didn't talk.
Yeah, in a separate place.
About it.
I just want us to note there are some really key people doing some work on accreditation that, if it's successful, I think will matter a lot. So we should just know that that's happening. And if folks are interested in that, I think there's people doing that, number one. Number two, it doesn't, who knows if it will pass in our federal legislation, but there's some work around enabling Pell grants. So these are grants for low income students to do shorter term credentials, which could get really interesting around different types of competitors. So there's some stuff.
Yeah, but I would agree with them here, because I think as it stands right now, to launch Minerva took like $100 million. To launch UATX took some godly sum of money. College Unbound, Reach University, Quantic School of Business Technology, they're almost the exceptions that prove the rule at present. And I think supply is so limited that partially explains why costs have gone up writ large over the last many decades. And it is really hard to start something outside the system. Like the short-term Pell you just referenced, that is locked to accredited institutions. Yeah. It is like a
Mm.
whole set of institutions aren't going to be able to use it. And so it is really hard to start something outside the system because you're competing with something that does get a subsidy and you don't. We at Minerva were accredited, but we've chosen not to accept that subsidy to this point.
Yeah.
I think that's been the right decision, but I'm just saying it's created barriers to entry such that I think all the coding boot camps and apprenticeships and other promising sort of stabs at this have struggled. And so I actually thought their
Mm.
point was right. And I'll just name it, like if Stig Leshley, our friend, colleague, his post-secondary commission accreditor does get through, I do think it changes the game. And that's probably where you're going with this,
That is
Diane. But I think at status quo, Ben and Marc nailed this, I would say.
Don't disagree. And certainly my experience for 20 years in the K-12 environment as a charter school operator and is consistent with the rightful fears there. And as I look about at what sort of, even if initially wasn't blocked, what's kind of washed away over the time. I mean, it's a real fear.
Yeah,
Let
I
me
wonder,
turn,
just kind of on this, the startup as kind of some version of a bundle, which is I think what they're saying, right? It's like a
yeah.
competitive institution that has some version of the bundle. Um, I wonder, Michael, like, is there some like pseudo non-consumption at a big enough scale happening in the
Mm.
marketplace? So some of these kids we talked about, or some of these types of student profiles that we talked about earlier, that the current setup just does not work for, and creates this enormous debt load and stuff. Like, maybe if you're not, Minerva's charter is to compete with elite institutions, as or
Right.
some of these others we've referenced, but maybe there's more opportunity if you really got clear about a student profile or two that is currently not being served at all, or being served so badly that it puts them as you know worse than underserved, like negatively served, that there may be some opening for, because maybe that kind of place, I guess the finances are still an issue, but what kind of credential does it need if it's
Well,
got good partnerships with some set of employers or a couple of industries, for instance.
so
So
maybe this
I don't
is
know.
a cool place to maybe this is a cool place for us to wrap because I think to that point, Stacey, this goes back to the quote at the very beginning of the first episode that Ben led with on the quote unquote scam. What I might say is you got sort of two options here. One, you have an employer driven model, which looks a lot like apprenticeships, which Diane and I have gotten very excited about as an alternative.
Yeah.
And it's learner centered, but it's actually employer centered as well. And that to me is the two things that I would anchor on in the new system. And I think it would get those incentives right, to your point.
Mm-hmm.
And number two, I think the other option is like we're seeing players fill the non-consumption. They're the Western Governors Universities. They
Yeah.
are the Southern New Hampshire universities.
Good point.
And then my co-host on my other podcast, Future You, says, well, why aren't more people pouring into this ginormous adult learning opportunity? And I think the reason is because we've said for profit, you can't play. And capital, as you know, likes to go where there will be a
Yeah.
return. But number two, the incentives really suck for profit right now because they're incentivized to enroll. And
Right.
we've seen that movie play out. And so
Yeah.
that's the other piece of this, which is I would love to see the accredited players have skin in the game so
Hmm.
that if their students don't get good paying jobs and are going to default on debt, that they have some penalty for that.
Yeah. I
And
like
to
that.
me, then you could open up the capital markets and then start to scale some different looking players against this,
Yeah.
because we'd be focused on the outcomes at the
I,
end of the day.
Mhm.
I love that, Michael. I agree. It's a really good place to wrap. We could continue talking about this for a really long time. I suspect the three of us
6
will
hours.
when
Yeah.
we're offline. But maybe we should turn to, we didn't do this on the first episode, but we should do it here because we were listening to that podcast. Stacey, we always do, what are you watching, listening to, reading, hopefully outside of quote business.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Well, one thing I'm watching and listening to is spring training. So baseball's back. We're in full swing of spring training in Florida and Arizona, and so like I'm drawing attention to there. But then I'm also like listening to a novel called The Covenant of Water, by Abraham Verghese, which I had not. I know it's been around a while, but I am totally into it. It's like one of those multi-generational stories that I love. It spans 70 years from 1900 to 1977. The author is actually the like vice chair of medicine at Stanford Medical School. So he's a doctor and writes fiction. And so there's like a ton of amazing stuff about the evolution of medical practice during those years. I'm loving it. I'm on like chapter 19 of 87, and I'm so glad that there's that much left of it. That's how
Oh,
much I'm
wow.
loving it. Yeah. So I totally recommend it if you haven't read it.
That's
Well,
awesome. Diane, what about you?
Well, I have read it and love, love, love it. So that's an awesome one. So folks who've been listening know that I'm on my way to visit my son in Scotland here pretty soon, and we've got an upcoming trip. And so, in my quest to continue to learn about that area, I'm actually reading Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations and David Hume's A Treatise on Human Nature. Please do not laugh at me. Sometimes it's important to read the primary sources.
I
And,
try not to laugh.
I mean, so when we were talking Aristotle and Socrates and stuff, I had to laugh a little, and the human nature and the growth mindset. But I think what's more interesting is at the same time, I'm playing with a new AI application, like I know we all are, that supports sort of learning journeys for like, people like me who aren't trying to get a credential, but are trying to learn. And I'm having a conversation with it about these readings, and it's giving me projects and quizzes and all sorts of ways to
Love it.
learn and interact with the material. It's pretty fascinating. How about
That's
you, Michael?
awesome. That's awesome. I have a few different directions I could go because I'm still on the tennis kick, to parallel Stacey's baseball, but that's not where I'm going. Last night, so this is someone could figure out when we're recording these episodes, but last night we went to the Somerville movie theater, which is one of these old-fashioned movie
Love
theaters,
it.
to hear an author speak. Her name is Kelly Yang. She lives in the LA area. She's originally from China. She immigrated here when she was like 5 or 6 or something like that.
Mm.
And she's written many children's books, and my kids had read them, or one or two of them. We left with like 8 of them. She has a YA novel as well. But the one that I was reading was Finally Seen, which was what they had read. I'm literally like every chapter, I'm like sobbing. Now that was not their reaction, but it works on many
Wow.
levels, I guess is the
Wow.
point. And then her new book that she is launching, and that's why everyone filled a theater last night, is called Finally Heard, which is the sequel to Finally Seen. And it's about the perils of social media through this story of an immigrant family. And so it's all about how to be happy and extraordinary, which, as she said last night, can often compete against each other in our lives. I've been reading so much John Haidt that I was like so thrilled that a children's book author would tackle this topic in a really fun, enjoyable narrative. So
It's awesome.
I'm excited to read it once I've finished the first book. But with that said, a huge thank you to our friend Stacey. Thank you for joining us, Stacey.
Thanks for having me.
I will add a huge thank you to Marc and Ben for devoting so much time and thought to the challenges in higher ed, sparking our 2 reactions. And I hope that they'll listen to this, and I hope that they will take it in the spirit in which we were offered, which is really building on the foundation that they have laid for a really, really critical conversation for society. Because as they said, universities have all these warts, and they do all these important things at the same time. And we can hold both of that in our head at the same time. And just a last thank you to all of our listeners for staying with us on this longer journey than usual. But we hope we'll see you next time on Class Disrupted.